The morning Charles Donovan rode into Caldwell, Kansas. He had no idea that the dusty telegram folded in his shirt pocket would change every single thing about the life he had so carefully built around loneliness. It was the spring of 1879, and the Santa Fe Trail was still breathing its last ragged breaths as the railroad pushed further west, swallowing up the old wagon roads and the desperate hopes of the men who had once depended on them. Charles had been one of those men once, a trail driver who had pushed longhorns up from Texas more times than he could count, sleeping under open skies and waking to nothing but the smell of cattle and dust, and the particular kind of freedom that comes with owing nobody anything. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled at his collar and hands that carried every scar the frontier had thought to give him. He was not an unhappy man, but he was a solitary one, which he had always told himself was the same thing, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He had come to Caldwell to collect a debt from a man named Sutter, and instead he found Hector Ralston sitting on the front steps of the hotel with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a look in his eyes that Charles recognized immediately as the look of a man who had already made peace with the fact that he was dying. Hector was 62 years old, though he looked older, weathered down to the bone by years of homesteading just north of the Cimarron River, on a piece of land he had broken open with nothing but stubborn hope and 2 good mules. Charles had known Hector for the better part of a decade. He had driven cattle past the old man's property half a dozen times, and Hector had always come out to the fence line to wave and offer cold water from his well, and Charles had always accepted, because Hector Ralston was the kind of man who made you feel like accepting kindness was something you deserved. "Donovan," Hector said, and his voice had the hollow rattle of a man who could not get enough air into his lungs. "I was hoping God had enough mercy to send you through here before I went." Charles dismounted, tied his horse at the post, and sat down beside the old man without being asked. "What's wrong with you, Hector?" "Doctor says my heart is finished," Hector said simply, as if they were discussing the weather. "Says I have got maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I stop drinking this." He held up the whiskey bottle and looked at it for a moment and then took a slow sip. "I figure if it is my last few weeks, I will drink what I please." Charles did not argue with that. He took the bottle when Hector offered it and had a pull himself, and for a moment they sat together in the spring sunlight while the town of Caldwell moved around them. "I have a daughter," Hector said finally. "I know," Charles said. He had heard about Gertrude Ralston over the years, had heard her mention the way frontier men mention their most precious and most carefully kept things. "She is in Missouri, isn't she? Staying with her aunt?" "Was," Hector said. "Her aunt passed last winter. Gertrude is in Wichita now, waiting for word from me. She came back west thinking she would help me on the homestead, but I wrote her to wait in Wichita because I did not want her to see me like this." He paused and breathed slowly, deliberately, like a man rationing air. "I need you to go get her, Donovan." Charles looked at him. "I need you to bring her to the homestead so I can see her one last time," Hector said, and his voice cracked on the last word just slightly, the way a man's voice cracks when he has been holding something heavy for too long. "And after I am gone, I need you to take her safely to Denver. I have a cousin there, Margaret Calloway, a widow woman with a good house and respectable standing. Margaret has already written saying she will take Gertrude in and help her find a proper situation. But the road to Denver is rough, and there are men on that road who take advantage of women traveling alone, and I cannot bear to think of Gertrude out there without someone I trust watching over her." "Hector," Charles started. "I know what I am asking," Hector said firmly, turning to look at him with those faded blue eyes that had gone very clear and very steady. "I am asking you to do a hard thing out of kindness for a dying man. I am asking you to give up however many weeks it will take, because I do not have a single other soul in this world I trust the way I trust you." That was not entirely true, and both of them knew it. But the reason it was not entirely true was something Charles did not think about too carefully. Hector Ralston trusted him because Charles had once pulled his then 15-year-old son out of the Cimarron River during a cattle crossing, a boy who had been swept under and come up screaming, and Charles had gone in after him without a second thought. The boy, Tommy, had died 3 years later of a fever, and Hector had grieved that so deeply that it had taken something permanent out of him. And yet every time he looked at Charles Donovan, he saw the man who had given him 3 more years with his son. That was the kind of debt that made a man trust you with his most precious thing. Charles took another pull of the whiskey and looked out at the street where a freight wagon was rumbling past, kicking up a wall of yellow dust. He thought about the debt he had come to collect from Sutter, which was $40 and honestly not worth the trouble. He thought about the trail up to Denver and the character of the men who worked that road. He thought about what it meant to tell a dying man no. "All right," he said. "Tell me where she is in Wichita." The look that crossed Hector Ralston's face was not relief. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, something that looked almost like the particular sorrow of a man who is grateful and heartbroken in the same breath. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This letter tells her about me, about Margaret in Denver, and about you. I have told her you are coming and that she is to trust you completely." He paused. "Be patient with her, Charles. She is stubborn and she is proud, and she has had a harder few years than she lets on. But she is a good woman, the best woman I know excepting her mother." Charles took the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket, where it would sit beside the telegram about Sutter's debt for the entire 60-mile ride to Wichita, pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. He found Gertrude Ralston in a boarding house on Douglas Avenue, in a small room on the second floor that she had clearly made as tidy as the limitations of the space would allow. She answered his knock with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for difficult news and had decided to meet it standing up. She was 23 years old, and he had not expected her to be quite so completely herself. That was the only way he could think about it afterward, in the long hours of riding, going back over the moment of meeting her. She was medium height, with reddish-brown hair pulled back in a practical knot and dark green eyes that assessed him so directly and so efficiently that he felt briefly like a horse being evaluated for soundness. She was not soft, and she was not fragile, and there was a quality of compressed energy about her, like a spring wound tight, that he found immediately and unexpectedly interesting. "Mr. Donovan," she said. She had his father's letter in her hand, already opened, which told him she had been watching from the window and had known someone was coming. "You had better come in." The room was small enough that there was nowhere to stand except in the middle of it, and he held his hat in both hands and watched her read the letter through again, slowly, even though she had clearly already read it. He could see the exact moment she got to the part about Hector's heart, because her jaw tightened and a muscle moved in her throat, but she did not cry. She folded the letter carefully, put it in the pocket of her dress, and looked up at him. "When do we leave?" she asked. He had expected grief or argument, or at minimum some period of adjustment. What he got was a woman who had already done her adjusting somewhere private and was now simply ready to move forward, which he found both admirable and a little startling. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "if that gives you enough time." "It gives me plenty of time," she said. "I have not accumulated very much." That last sentence was said with a certain flat evenness that told him it was a fact she had made peace with, not a complaint, and he respected that. He told her to meet him at the livery stable on Market Street at first light, gave her a brief description of the route they would take back to Caldwell, and then turned to go. "Mr. Donovan," she said, and he stopped with his hand on the door frame. "My father trusts you very much. That is not something he does easily." She paused. "I want you to know that I am not helpless. I can ride and I can shoot, and I am not going to be a burden to you." He looked back at her. "I never thought you would be," he said, which was true, and something in her expression shifted slightly, just enough to tell him the answer had been the right one. He left her to her packing and went to find Sutter, collected the $40, decided immediately that it had not been worth the ride, and spent the rest of the afternoon buying supplies for the trip. hardtack and dried beans and a good side of salt pork, ammunition for his Winchester and his Colt, a spare canteen, and a bedroll blanket that he thought might be more comfortable for her than the one she likely had. He did not examine too closely why he made that last purchase. She was at the livery before him in the morning. He arrived in the gray pre-dawn light to find her standing beside a solidly built bay mare, her bag already tied, wearing a divided riding skirt and a plain cotton blouse under a canvas jacket, her hair pinned up under a weathered hat that had belonged, he would later learn, to her mother. She was speaking quietly to the mare, running her hand along the horse's neck in the easy, practiced way of someone who had grown up around horses. "Good morning," she said when she heard him approach, and there was something different in her voice that morning, something more guarded and more careful, as if the night had reminded her that this journey was not an ordinary thing. "Good morning," he said, and they left Wichita as the sky was turning pink in the east, riding side by side down the rutted road that cut south through the rolling grass of the Kansas plains. For the first several miles they were quiet in the way that two strangers on a shared errand are quiet, each of them contained within their own thoughts, and Charles found himself grateful for the fact that she did not feel the need to fill silence with noise. He had traveled with men who talked constantly to cover their nerves, and it was exhausting, and she was not like that. She rode well, sitting straight and easy in the saddle, moving with the horse rather than against it, and she watched the country they were passing through with an attentiveness that told him she was not simply looking at it but actually seeing it. "About 10 miles south of Wichita," she said. "Tell me about him. How does he look?" Charles thought about how to answer that honestly without being cruel. "He is thinner than when I saw him last autumn," he said, "but his mind is still sharp. He is still very much himself." She nodded, looking straight ahead at the road. "He would not have written me the full truth of how bad it was," she said. "He would have tried to protect me from worrying." "That sounds about right," Charles said. "He has always done that," she said. "Even when my mother was dying, he kept telling me she was going to be fine right up until 2 days before the end. He could not bear to see me afraid." She paused. "It used to frustrate me. Now I think it was one of the most loving things about him." Charles said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and she did not seem to need him to. They reached Caldwell in the early evening of the second day, the ride having taken them through country that was beautiful in the merciless way of the Kansas plains in spring, all wind and green grass, and a sky so enormous it made you feel both very small and very alive. They had stopped the first night at a small way station, where a taciturn couple ran a respectable operation, giving up their one spare room to Gertrude and charging Charles a reasonable price for the privilege. Hector Ralston was sitting in a chair on his porch when they rode up to the homestead, as if he had known exactly when they would arrive. The evening light was slanting long and golden across the yard, and for a moment Charles saw him the way Gertrude must have seen him, as a man who had once been big and solid and was now something diminished, held together mostly by will. But his face when he saw her coming through the gate lit up with something so complete and so joyful that it transformed him, and Gertrude was off her horse before Charles had even fully stopped riding, crossing the yard at a run and dropping to her knees beside her father's chair and taking his hands in hers. Charles led both horses to the water trough and found a reason to check the saddle straps for several minutes, giving them privacy. He stayed for 3 weeks. He had told himself he would drop her off and make sure the old man was settled and then go, but somehow the days arranged themselves differently. There was always something useful to do, a fence post that needed resetting, a leaky section of the roof that would cause problems come the next rain, a wagon wheel that had developed a worrying wobble. He told himself he was simply being useful, which was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated and more inconvenient. The whole truth was that Gertrude Ralston in her natural habitat was an entirely different thing from Gertrude Ralston in a boarding house room. Out here on the homestead, she worked with a kind of fierce, joyful competence that was something to see. She cooked on the cast iron stove with economy and skill, turning simple ingredients into meals that were genuinely good. She managed the vegetable garden with the intensity of someone who understood very well what the difference between a good harvest and a poor one actually meant for a family. She sat with her father in the evenings while the light faded, and she read to him from the two books on the shelf, and she argued with him cheerfully about the plots and characters in a way that made Hector laugh in a way that was clearly very good for him. And she talked to Charles, not in the careful, measured way of the first day, but in the gradually opening, increasingly honest way of a person who has decided that someone is worth the trouble of being real with. They talked in the evening sometimes, after Hector was in bed, sitting on the porch steps with coffee while the prairie night settled around them, and the conversation was the kind that moved easily from one thing to another, from her years in Missouri learning to be a proper young woman from her aunt, which she described with a dry humor that made him laugh out loud, to his years on the cattle trails, which she asked about with a genuine curiosity that was different from the romanticized interest most people brought to the subject. Was it lonely? She asked him one evening about 2 weeks into his stay. They were on the porch steps as usual. The sky above the prairie was doing the thing it did in the spring, where the stars came out so thick and clear that the darkness between them almost seemed to glow. Not in the way most people mean when they ask that, he said, considering. It is not lonely the way being alone in a room is lonely. The country is too big and too alive for that. But it is lonely in the sense that you are always moving past things. You never stay anywhere long enough to know it properly. You never know a place the way you know a place when you have seen it in all 4 seasons, and know where the water runs in the spring, and which way the wind turns before a storm. She was quiet for a moment. That is a very specific kind of loneliness, she said. Yes, he said, it is. She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her face was serious and very still. Is that why you have not settled? It was a direct question, the kind she had proven herself willing to ask when she thought the answer would be truthful and useful. He did not deflect it. Partly, he said, and partly because settling requires knowing what you are settling toward, not just what you are settling away from. And you have not known, she said. Not yet, he said, and then he was aware that they were looking at each other in a way that had moved past the ordinary, and he looked away first, back at the stars. And after a moment she did too, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence was different after that, warmer and more careful, like something new and fragile had been set down between them. Hector died on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of May. He had been failing for several days, moving less, sleeping more, the rasp in his chest deepening until it was audible from across the room. But on the Monday evening, he had a period of clarity and energy that both Charles and Gertrude recognized, privately and separately, as the kind that sometimes comes before the end. He ate a full supper, which he had not done in days, and he told stories about the early years on the homestead, about Gertrude's mother, about the summer they broke the south field and the mule ran off, and he had to pull the plow himself while his wife walked alongside him, laughing so hard she had to stop and hold her sides. He asked Charles to come outside with him for a few minutes after dinner, while Gertrude was washing up. They stood at the fence in the last of the light looking out at the property, and Hector said, "You will take her to Denver." "I will," Charles said. "You gave me your word already," Hector said, and it was not a question. "I know you will keep it. I want you to know that I know that." "Hector," Charles said, because there was something in the old man's tone that felt like more than a practical conversation about travel arrangements. "She likes you," Hector said simply. "She is careful about who she likes, and she does not show it in the way some women do. But I have known her for 23 years, and I know what it looks like when she has decided someone is worth caring about." He looked at Charles with those clear, faded eyes. "And I see how you look at her when you think nobody is watching." Charles was quiet. "I am not telling you what to do," Hector said. "I am a dying man, and I have no business arranging the futures of people who are not me. but I am telling you that Margaret Calloway in Denver is a good woman who will give Gertrude a safe and comfortable life, and that is the best I can arrange for her from where I stand. What you can arrange for her might be something different." He paused. "I am not asking you to promise me anything except to take her safely. The rest is between you and God and her." In the morning, Hector Ralston was gone. Gertrude sat with him for a long time, and Charles stayed in the yard and let her have the privacy of her grief. And when she finally came out, she was dry-eyed and straight-backed, and she said, very quietly, "We should bury him next to my mother." They buried Hector Ralston beside his wife in the small plot at the north end of the property, under a cottonwood tree that Gertrude said her mother had planted the first spring they were on the land. Charles dug the grave and Gertrude lined it with the quilt from her parents' bed. And when it was done, they stood at the graveside and Gertrude recited from memory a psalm that her mother had been fond of, her voice steady and clear in the morning air. It was only afterward in the kitchen, when she was putting the leftover food from the past few days into containers and her back was to him, that he heard the sound she made. A single caught breath that was very close to a sob and then stopped, as if she had clamped down on it, and he crossed the kitchen and put his hand on her shoulder, very gently, and she turned and put her face against his chest and cried properly for the first time, silently, with her hands fisted in the front of his shirt. And he held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and after a few minutes she was still. "Thank you," she said, stepping back, and she did not look embarrassed, which he appreciated. "I needed that." "I know," he said. They spent 2 more days at the homestead settling affairs. Charles rode into Caldwell and spoke to the local attorney, a careful man named Dawkins who handled the paperwork regarding the property and the few possessions, and made arrangements for the land to be sold, the proceeds to follow Gertrude to Denver, as Hector had already set up. Gertrude spent those days sorting through the house, keeping what could be packed into her bags, leaving what could not. On the evening before they were due to leave, Charles found her sitting on the porch with a small oil painting in her lap, about the size of a book, painted on a flat piece of wood. It was a rough painting, clearly done by someone without formal training, but it showed a woman standing in a field with the sky behind her, and even in the roughness of the brushwork there was something unmistakably alive about the figure. "My father painted this," she said. "It is my mother. He painted it the first winter they were married, when they were snowed in for 3 weeks, and he said it was the only time in his life he had nothing to do but look at her." She traced the edge of the wooden board with her thumb. He said painting it was the hardest thing he ever tried and the most worth doing, because it made him look at her so carefully that he saw things he had never noticed even after 2 years of marriage. Charles sat down beside her. They were close enough on the narrow step that he could feel the warmth of her arm against his. "What did he see?" he asked. "He said he saw that she was not afraid of anything," she said, "and that she thought everything was interesting." She looked at the painting for another moment. He said those 2 things were what he had fallen in love with, and that before he painted her he had known he loved her, but he had not known why. Afterward he knew. The silence that followed was the kind that contained something too large to be spoken directly. "Keep it safe in your bag," Charles said. "I will wrap it in my extra shirt so it does not get knocked about." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, but that made something warm and slightly unsteady move through his chest. "That is very kind," she said. "It matters to you," he said. "So it matters." She looked at the painting for a moment longer. Then she said very quietly, as if she were not entirely sure she meant to say it out loud, "You are not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked. "Someone more like the men my father described when he talked about trail drivers, capable, reliable, decent enough, but not—" She stopped. "Not what?" he said after a moment. She shook her head slightly, and there was something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Not someone I would think about after," she said, and she got up and went inside before he could find an answer for that. He sat on the step for a long time after that, in the prairie dark, thinking about what she had said and what he had not said in return, and what it meant that the thought of delivering her to Denver and riding away had started to feel like something he was moving toward that he did not actually want to arrive at. They left at sunrise. The road to Denver was 300 miles of varied country, the rolling Kansas plains giving way to the rougher, drier land of eastern Colorado, and then the land beginning to lift and roughen toward the distant blue-gray line of the mountains. It was a journey that would take at minimum 2 weeks on horseback, traveling at a reasonable pace, and Charles had planned the route carefully, mapping out the reliable water sources and the way station stops and the small towns where they could resupply. The first week was a revelation. He had spent enough time in her company at the homestead to think he knew the shape of her, but the trail opened her up in ways he had not anticipated. Away from the grief and the work of the homestead, away from the weight of her father's dying and all the arrangements that had surrounded it, she became something lighter and more expansive, curious about everything the country had to offer, asking questions about every plant and bird and geological formation they passed, with a genuine appetite for information that he found almost startling in its energy. She had a habit of naming things. Not official names, just her own names, based on the quality or the impression. A particular red-tailed hawk that followed them for half a day along a section of the trail she named Diligence. A section of creek that ran over pale yellow limestone she called the Lemon Crossing. A rock formation along the Colorado border that looked in a certain light like a seated figure she named the Patient Man, and he laughed when she said it and she looked pleased with herself. And afterward, every time he thought of that particular stretch of country, he thought of her name for it. She asked about his life before the cattle trail, and he told her about growing up in Illinois, about his father who had been a blacksmith and his mother who had read everything she could get her hands on, and had passed that habit on to him, about the decision at 19 to come west because the East had begun to feel too prescribed, too organized, every path already mapped out and his feet already set on one of them, and he had needed to go somewhere the map was still being drawn. "Did you find that?" she asked. They were riding along a dry creek bed where cottonwoods were leafing out in pale green, and the light through the leaves moved over her face in a shifting, dappled way that he was having some difficulty not looking at directly. "For a while," he said, "but then the frontier becomes its own kind of routine." "There is always a newer frontier," she observed. "There is always a newer frontier," he agreed. "But at some point you start to wonder if you have been chasing newness because newness is what you actually need, or because you were afraid of what would happen if you stopped." She looked at him sidelong. "What would happen if you stopped?" He met her look. "I suppose I might find out," he said, and she held his gaze for a moment with that direct, measuring quality of hers, and then she looked away and seemed to find something interesting happening in the cottonwood branches above them. On the 9th day out of Caldwell, they encountered trouble. They had stopped to water the horses at a small creek about 40 miles east of Pueblo, when 3 men came out of the cottonwood grove upstream, riding slowly, and with the particular kind of casual deliberateness that Charles recognized as the manner of men who wanted to look as though they were simply passing through while actually taking inventory. He kept his hands easy and visible, but positioned himself between them and Gertrude as they approached, which she noticed and did not comment on, though he was aware of her moving her horse slightly left to give him more room, which told him she had assessed the situation with the same speed he had. The men were rough-looking, trail-worn in a way that spoke less of honest work than of long periods of purposeless drifting. The one in the lead had pale eyes and a way of looking at Gertrude that Charles disliked immediately and intensely. "Afternoon," the man said. "You folks heading to Pueblo?" "Possibly," Charles said, which gave nothing away. "Nice horse the lady has," the pale-eyed man said, looking at Gertrude's mare. "She is a good horse," Charles said evenly. His right hand was resting on his thigh 2 inches from the colt at his hip. "Were you headed after Pueblo?" the man pressed. "That is our business," Charles said, and let a specific quality into his voice, the quality that said he was not nervous, that he had been in this kind of conversation before, and that he was comfortable with where it went next regardless of what the other man chose. There was a long moment in which the pale-eyed man looked at Charles and Charles looked back at him with complete steadiness, and then something shifted in the pale-eyed man's expression, a small recalculation, and he said, "Fair enough. Enjoy the trail," and the three of them rode on past without further incident. Charles waited until they were well out of sight and earshot before he let his shoulders drop half an inch. "That could have gone worse," Gertrude said. "It could have," he said. "You were not afraid," she said. It was an observation, not quite a question. "I was a little afraid," he said honestly. "There were three of them." She looked at him. "You did not look it." "Looking it would not have helped anything," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I had my hand on my pistol the whole time." He looked at her. She met his look with perfect calm. He found himself laughing, not from amusement exactly, but from something more like recognition, a kind of warm, expanding awareness that this woman was genuinely remarkable and that he was not, at this point, even slightly surprised by it. "I know you did," he said, because he had seen the angle of her arm and he had been glad of it. That evening they made camp on the bank of the same creek, upstream from where they had met the three men, in a spot sheltered by a curve in the bank and a stand of young willows. It was their first night camping without the option of a way station, and Charles built the fire and put together a meal of salt pork and beans, while Gertrude unsaddled and tended the horses with the efficiency of long practice. They ate by the fire, and afterward the night was very still and warm, the creek making its small, persistent sound in the darkness, and they sat on their bedrolls, and the conversation was different that night, lower and more confiding, the way conversation gets when the darkness is friendly, and the fire is warm, and you are far enough from other people to feel the particular intimacy of being two small points of light in a very large and benign darkness. She told him about the years in Missouri with her aunt, which had been good years in some ways and difficult in others. Her aunt had been a proper, careful woman who had meant well and done right by Gertrude in the practical ways, given her a good education and a knowledge of domestic management, and kept her safe and comfortable. But she had not been warm, had not been the kind of woman who asked you how you actually were, and listened to the real answer. And Gertrude had been lonely there in the specific way of someone who is surrounded by adequate provision and starving for genuine connection. "I used to write letters to my father that were much longer than the ones I sent," she said. "I would write everything I was actually feeling, all the frustration and the longing and the things I was figuring out about myself, and then I would put that letter aside and write a shorter, more cheerful one to send him because I did not want to worry him." "He did the same thing," Charles said quietly. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and tender. "Yes," she said, "I know. We were both protecting each other and both lonely, and we were 40 miles apart and could have just talked." "Why didn't you?" he said, not critically, genuinely curious. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Because saying the real thing out loud makes it real," she said. "And sometimes you are not ready for it to be real. Sometimes the distance makes it manageable." He thought about that. "And now," he said, she looked up from the fire and at him. "Now I think the distance was costing more than the protection was worth," she said softly. "I think I would give a great deal to have those conversations back." He held her gaze. The fire moved in the space between them, and the creek whispered in the willows, and somewhere out in the darkness a night bird called once and was silent. "For what it is worth," he said carefully, "I think saying the real thing is always worth it, even when it is frightening, especially when it is frightening." She was very still. "Is there something real you are thinking of saying?" she asked, and her voice was quiet but absolutely steady, with that directness she brought to every important question. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the firelight on her face, the steadiness of those green eyes, the particular quality of her attention that had been one of the first things he had noticed about her and had not stopped noticing. "Yes," he said, "but not tonight." "Why not tonight?" she said. "Because we have another week of trail left," he said. "And I want to know I have said it at the right time, and not just because a fire and a creek and the dark made it feel easier than it is." She looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded slowly, and that small movement told him she understood exactly what he meant, and that she respected the carefulness of it, and possibly that she was not entirely displeased. "All right," she said. "Not tonight." They reached Pueblo 3 days later, resupplied, stayed one night at a decent hotel, and then continued west and north along the route that would take them up through the Colorado foothills toward Denver. The country changed dramatically around them as they rode north. The flat, windswept plains gave way to rolling rises, and then to real hills, pine-scented and cooler than the lowlands, with long views out over country that was bigger and wilder than anything they had passed through yet. Gertrude rode with her head up and her eyes wide, and Charles watched her take in the mountains with an expression that was unguarded in a way she did not often allow herself to be, a pure, uncomplicated pleasure in the bigness of the world. "I have never been this far west," she said, pulling her horse to a stop on a rise where the whole front range of the Rockies was visible in the clear air, still snow-capped in late May, impossibly large and impossibly close. "What do you think?" he said, stopping beside her. "I think my father was wrong to worry about me making this journey," she said. "I think if you had told me what it looked like out here, I would have come years ago." "What would you have done out here?" he asked. She considered it seriously, not dismissively. "I do not know exactly. Something real. Something with the country in it, not just polite rooms and careful conversation." She glanced at him. "What would you do if you stopped, if you picked a place?" He looked out at the mountains. He had been thinking about this question in various forms for the better part of 2 weeks. "Something with land," he said. "Not a homestead exactly. Something more like a small ranch, horses rather than cattle. I understand horses better than I understand cattle, and I always have more patience for them." "Horses," she said thoughtfully. "There is good country for it south of Denver," he said. "I rode through it 3 years ago and thought then that it was the kind of country that made you want to stay." She looked at him with a quality of careful attention that he had come to recognize as her way of processing something important. "And did you?" she said. "Stay? No," he said. "I was not ready yet. And now?" She said, and it was the same question she had asked at the creek, the one that had become the recurring note in the particular song their conversations had become over the past 2 weeks. He turned to look at her, squarely, in the way he had been building toward for the better part of a fortnight. "I am getting ready," he said. The words landed between them in the clear mountain air, and she held his gaze with those steady green eyes, and the color in her face was brighter than the cold air entirely accounted for, and he was very aware of wanting very much to close the distance between them, and very deliberately choosing not to yet, because he had made himself a promise about timing. They rode on. Denver in the spring of 1879 was a city that was still making up its mind about what it was going to be. It had the bones of ambition, broad streets and substantial brick buildings, and the energy of a place that believed absolutely in its own future. But it was also still rough around the edges in ways that the ambition hadn't quite smoothed over yet, with the frontier and the city pressed up against each other at every turn. It was loud and dusty, and smelled of horses and commerce and wood smoke and possibility, and both of them could feel it the moment they rode in, that particular vibration of a place in the process of becoming. Margaret Calloway's house was on a quiet street 3 blocks north of the main commercial district, a well-built 2-story frame house painted white, with a kitchen garden along the south side and a small porch where an iron bench sat under the window. Margaret herself answered the door before they had even tied the horses, as if she had been watching from the window. She was a woman of about 50, compact and brisk, with silver-streaked hair and observant dark eyes, and she took one look at the two of them standing at her gate, and her expression did something complicated and knowing that neither of them missed. She embraced Gertrude warmly, and she shook Charles's hand with a firm grip, and she said, Come inside, both of you, and let me put on something to eat. You have both been on the trail long enough to look like it." They ate at Margaret's kitchen table, a proper meal with fresh bread and roasted chicken and early vegetables from the kitchen garden, and Margaret asked questions about Hector, and listened to the answers with the quiet grief of someone receiving news she had been preparing for. She had known Hector Ralston for 40 years, had grown up 2 farms over from his family, and she spoke about him with the fond, specific affection of very old friendship, the kind that survives distance and years and the ordinary accumulation of separate lives. Gertrude was good at this table, Charles noticed. She was warmer here, more open than she had been at the boarding house in Wichita, and it was clear that she and Margaret had exchanged enough letters over the years to have the comfortable ease of people who already know each other in the important ways. Watching them together gave him a specific kind of reassurance that surprised him with its intensity. The knowledge that she would be safe here, that Margaret was good and warm and capable, and that this house was a genuinely good place. It also, he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge, gave him a hollowing sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with reassurance. After supper, Margaret showed Gertrude to her room and then came back down to where Charles was still sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She sat down across from him and folded her hands and looked at him with a directness that reminded him, powerfully, of Gertrude. "Hector wrote me about you," she said. "I know," he said. "He said you were a reliable man who would keep his word," she said. "He also said," she paused, choosing her words with care, "that he hoped you were smarter than most reliable men who do their duty and then leave before they figure out what they are leaving." Charles looked at his cold coffee. "She is not going anywhere immediately," Margaret said pleasantly. "Denver is a city with real possibilities for a capable young woman. There is teaching work at the new school. There are any number of respectable and interesting futures she could build here." She paused again. "I'm not suggesting she could not also build an interesting future elsewhere, in the right circumstances." Charles looked up at her. "I'm a widow who runs my own affairs and minds my own business," Margaret said, with a smile that was dry and warm in equal measure. "But I knew Hector Ralston for 40 years, and if he trusted you with the most important thing in his life, I take that seriously." She stood up and took his cold coffee cup and replaced it with a warm one from the pot on the stove. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need to. My stable has room for your horse." She went to bed and left him at the kitchen table with his warm coffee and the particular restlessness of a man who knows exactly what he wants to do and is working up to the moment of actually doing it. He was still at the table when Gertrude came back downstairs. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with a faint surprise. She had changed into a simpler dress and let her hair down from its pins, and she looked different like that, softer and more private, and he was aware of the unfairness of the light in that kitchen doorway, the way it fell on the reddish-brown of her hair and made everything unreasonably beautiful. "I thought you had gone to sleep," she said. "Not yet," he said. She came in and sat down at the table across from him in the chair Margaret had vacated. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with a quality of attention that told him she had come downstairs for a reason. "You said not tonight at the creek," she said, "about the real thing you wanted to say." "I did say that," he said. "We have been in Denver for 4 hours," she said. "We are not on the trail anymore. Is it tonight now?" He looked at her. He thought about Hector Ralston sitting on the hotel steps in Caldwell with a bottle of whiskey and the clear knowledge of his own ending, and the way the old man had said, with a dying man's absolute economy of words, that he saw how Charles looked at Gertrude when he thought nobody was watching. He thought about the trail, about the creek and the fire and the mountains and the question she kept asking, the patient, steady repetition of a woman who already knew the answer and was waiting for him to catch up. "I do not want to leave," he said. She was very still. "I have done the arithmetic on it 6 different ways over the past 2 weeks," he said, "and every calculation comes out the same. I do not want to deliver you here and ride back out and go on with the life I had before, Because the life I had before was a perfectly good life that is now going to feel extremely empty, and I am old enough to know the difference between empty and free." She looked at him, and there was something moving in her expression, something careful and wide open at once, like a door being held ajar against a strong wind. "You said you were getting ready," she said, "to stay somewhere." "I was talking about you," he said simply. "I was talking about the fact that the country south of Denver that I rode through 3 years ago is good horse country, and that I am 31 years old and I am tired of moving past things, and that somewhere in the last 3 weeks I have gone from being a man who was good at being alone to a man who cannot imagine the particular shape of any future that does not include you in it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence he had ever sat inside of, thick with everything that had been building since the moment she had opened the door of that boarding house room in Wichita, and looked at him with those green eyes as if she were evaluating whether he was worth the trouble of knowing. "That is the most words I have ever heard you say at once," she said finally, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I have been practicing," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the full one, not the controlled, polite version he had heard in the first days, and it did something irreversible to the expression on her face, opened it completely, and for a moment she looked entirely unguarded and entirely herself, and he thought that he had traveled very far in his life and seen a great deal of country, and nothing had ever looked to him the way she looked to him in that moment. "I want to ask you something," she said, when the laugh had settled. "And I want you to answer honestly, the way you have been doing, because I have had enough careful half-answers from the people who were supposed to love me and I cannot tolerate any more of them." "Ask," he said. "If my father had not asked you to bring me here," she said, "if you had met me some other way, some ordinary way, just two people in the same place at the same time, would you still be sitting here saying what you are saying?" He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Because what I am saying has nothing to do with your father or the promise I made him, and everything to do with who you are. You are the most genuinely interesting person I have ever been on a trail with, which sounds like a small compliment but is not, because the trail strips away every pretension a person has and shows you exactly who they are, and who you are is someone I want to spend a very long time knowing." She was quiet for a moment after that, and he watched the processing happening in her expression, the careful, thorough way she had of turning something over and examining all its sides before she committed to it. "I need to say something too," she said. "Say it," he said. "I was furious with my father for a full day when I read his letter," she said. "Not about his dying, which was grief, not fury. But the part about Denver, about Margaret, about the cousin with the respectable house who would help me find a proper situation. I was furious because it was kind and well-intentioned and it felt like being arranged, like a parcel being sent to a safe address." She paused. "And then I met you, and the first day I thought you were exactly what you turned out to be, which was a good, capable, decent man with no visible imagination, and that was fine, that was appropriate for the assignment." "Thank you," he said dryly. "And then," she continued, ignoring him with a smile at the corner of her mouth, "somewhere around the third day I started noticing that I was wrong about the imagination part. And somewhere around the second week I noticed that I was thinking about things I wanted to tell you before I had told them to anyone else, which is not something I have done with very many people." She looked at him directly, that full, steady gaze. "And I am not a person who does things because they are arranged. I am a person who does things because she has looked at them honestly and decided they are worth doing." "And have you," he said quietly, "looked at this honestly?" "Yes," she said. "I have been looking at it honestly since you put your hand on my shoulder in my father's kitchen." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and the simple solidity of it, the warmth and the reality of her hand in his, was so disproportionately significant that he had to take a slow breath to contain the size of it. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "I would like to stay in Denver for a time and do this the right way, with Margaret's knowledge and approval, and find out whether what we have is what I think it is." "And what do you think it is?" she said, "I think it is the real thing," he said. "I have never said that about anything before, so I am aware that my sample size is small, but I think when you know, and I know." She looked at him with her eyes bright and her mouth curved in that smile that was not entirely under control, the one that showed up when she was very pleased about something and had not yet decided whether to let him see how pleased she was. "Yes," she said. "You can court me properly. Margaret will approve. She told me not 2 hours ago that you had kind eyes and good hands, which from her are the highest compliments she gives anyone." He laughed at that, and she laughed too, and Margaret, who had in fact not gone entirely to bed and was entirely prepared to admit to nothing, heard them laughing in her kitchen and went upstairs to her room with a warmth in her chest that was partly Hector and partly the particular pleasure of watching things come right. Charles stayed in Denver. He moved into a room at a respectable boarding house on the next street over, which was appropriate and entirely what Margaret expected of him, and he presented himself at Margaret's front door every morning to see if either woman needed anything, and 3 or 4 evenings a week he came for supper, and on Sunday afternoons he and Gertrude walked through the newer parts of the city, where the streets were still being laid out and the buildings were going up, and they talked with the unending, interested thoroughness of two people who are still discovering the shape of each other and finding it consistently better than anticipated. He found work easily. There was always work in Denver in 1879 for a man who knew horses and was not afraid of labor. He hired himself out to a livery stable for immediate income, and he spent his free hours riding south of the city into the country he had described to Gertrude on the trail, the rolling land below the mountains where the grass grew thick in the stream valleys, and the air had the particular quality of high altitude in summer, clean and sharp and very alive. He found a property on the third week of looking. It was 160 acres along a small tributary of the South Platte, with a creek that ran reliable through the summer, a stand of pines on the western rise that would break the winter wind, and a deteriorating but structurally sound cabin that had been abandoned when its previous owner had gone back east. It was exactly the kind of property that required significant work to become what he wanted it to be, which meant it was priced within the range of what he had saved over 11 years of cattle driving and careful living. He brought Gertrude to see it on a Saturday in early July. She walked every inch of it with the focused attention she brought to everything she considered seriously, the creek bottom and the pine rise and the south-facing slope where the grass was good, and she went inside the cabin and stood in the middle of the single main room with its cracked plaster walls and sagging porch boards and looked at it with an expression that had nothing of judgment in it, only calculation. "The bones are good," she said. "The plaster can be done. The porch boards can be replaced. The chimney will need to be repointed or it will be a hazard." He looked at her. "Are you evaluating this as someone who would be visiting it or as someone who might be living in it?" She turned to look at him. She was standing in the middle of what would eventually become a proper sitting room, with the summer light coming through the dirty window behind her and her hat in her hand, and she looked entirely like what she was, a woman who had grown up on a frontier homestead and knew exactly what it took to make a piece of wild country into a home, and who was standing in this particular piece of wild country making a decision. "I would like to know," she said, "what you are asking before I answer that question." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the dusty summer light. Then he said, "I am asking if you will marry me, Gertrude. I am asking if this is the country and this is the life, and I am the man you would choose if you had the full freedom to choose." She held his gaze with those steady green eyes. "I have thought about very little else for the past 6 weeks," she said. "I have thought about it in the morning when I wake up and at night when I cannot sleep, and in the middle of every conversation I have had about Denver and what I might do here and what my future might look like. I have thought about every reason it might be impractical, and every reason it might be premature, and every way it might go wrong, because that is how my mind works." She paused. "And every time I finish thinking about all of those things, I come back to the fact that when I imagine a future without you in it, I feel a specific kind of loss that I do not feel when I imagine any of the other futures I might have, and I have decided that that specific feeling is more trustworthy than all the practical calculations combined. Is that a yes? He said. Yes, she said. That is a yes. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands, very carefully, like something he had been waiting a long time to do, and he kissed her in the dusty summer light of the cabin they were going to make into a home, and she kissed him back with the full commitment of a woman who had made her decision and was not in the habit of doing things halfway. They were married in September. Margaret organized it with the efficient warmth that characterized everything she did. A modest ceremony at the church 2 streets from her house, with a small gathering of Margaret's friends and acquaintances who had adopted Gertrude into their social circle over the summer, and the minister who read the words with appropriate gravity and a certain visible approval of the 2 people in front of him. Gertrude wore a dress of deep blue wool that Margaret had helped her make, with her mother's small pearl earrings in her ears and her hair pinned up under a hat trimmed with what she privately described as an indecent quantity of ribbon. She was so beautiful that Charles forgot for a moment to say the appropriate words when prompted, and the minister had to prompt him twice, which caused a sound from the assembled congregation that was not quite a laugh but was close, and Gertrude gave him a look of such pure, amused tenderness that the minister had to clear his throat and look at his book. Charles said his vows with complete and deliberate attention to every word, and Gertrude said hers in that clear, steady voice that did not waver at any point, and when it was done, she was Mrs. Donovan and they were standing outside the church in the September sunshine, with Margaret clasping both their hands and looking at them with the warm, satisfied expression of a woman who has done a good thing and knows it. At the reception in Margaret's parlor, full of the warm noise of good company and the smell of coffee and Margaret's excellent gingerbread, Charles found a moment to stand with Margaret at the side of the room, while Gertrude was holding court at the other end, making 3 of Margaret's friends laugh simultaneously about something he could not hear. Hector would have been pleased, Margaret said quietly. He looked at the woman across the room who was his wife, who was laughing with her whole face and gesturing with one hand in the particular animated way she had when she was telling a story, and he thought about Hector Ralston sitting on the hotel steps in Caldwell with a bottle of whiskey and the look of a man who had made his peace. Yes, he said, I think he would have. The autumn and winter were the hardest and the most satisfying work of his life. They moved onto the property in October, into the cabin that was not yet fully repaired, but was warm enough with the wood stove going and dry enough with the new roof boards he had laid in September. They worked through the days side by side, and she was exactly what he had known she would be, not a woman who observed while he worked, but a full and serious partner in every aspect of the labor, mixing plaster and swinging a hammer and making decisions about the layout of the kitchen garden that she had already planned out in her head the day they had come to look at the property. He learned things about her in those months that the trail had given him glimpses of but not the full picture. She was a person of very strong opinions, which she held firmly until presented with a better argument, at which point she changed her mind with a completeness and lack of ego that he found genuinely admirable. She was not easy to discourage. When the first 3 fence posts he set in the hard Colorado clay refused to stay plumb, she looked at the problem for about 2 minutes and then suggested a method she had watched her father use with a different soil composition. And it worked. And when he said so, she was pleased but not smug, which was exactly the right proportion. She had a way of singing to herself while she worked, not full songs, just fragments, often the same phrase repeated with slight variations, and he found after a few weeks that he had begun to listen for it as a kind of register of her contentment, that the singing meant she was happy, and on the days when she was silent he was aware of it as a different quality of quiet. He loved her with the specific, daily, practical love of a man who has found the person he makes sense with, and also with the larger, less manageable love that showed up unexpectedly at moments like finding her asleep in the chair by the stove with a book in her lap, and the firelight moving over her face, or watching her stand at the door in the morning and look out at the mountains with the expression she had had the first time she saw them, open and full of pleasure, as though the world were still every morning. A remarkable thing. She told him she was expecting their first child in February, standing at the kitchen table with the same directness she brought to every important piece of information, looking at him with those clear green eyes to gauge his reaction. His reaction was immediate and complete and entirely uncomplicated. He crossed the kitchen and picked her up, which she protested from a purely practical standpoint while clearly not being opposed to it in principle. And the joy of it, the simple, enormous joy of it, was large enough that he was laughing and could not stop, and after a moment she was laughing too. They had a boy in October of 1880, born in the cabin that by then had been fully repaired and extended, with a second room and a proper porch, and everything that the cabin's original bones had promised it could become. They named him Henry Hector Donovan, Henry for Charles's father and Hector for hers, and he was a red-faced, extremely loud, completely perfect child who made his opinions on every subject very clear from his first hours of life, and did not stop making them clear, which everyone who met him agreed was entirely consistent with his heritage from both sides. Margaret came to stay for 3 weeks after the baby arrived, and her presence was the best possible thing, practical and warm and full of the particular confidence of a woman who has navigated a great many of life's difficult passages and come out the other side knowing something useful. She and Gertrude spent those 3 weeks in the way of women who are close and comfortable, talking while they worked and working while they talked, and Charles moved around the edges of this warmth and was grateful for every moment of it. On the last evening before Margaret went back to Denver, she sat on the new porch with Charles while Gertrude was inside nursing the baby, and the Colorado evening was coming in over the mountains in a long wash of gold and violet, the way it did in the autumn, with a clarity of light that seemed to make everything more itself. "You are happy," Margaret said. It was an observation with the quality of a gift. "Yes," he said, "I am." Hector used to say that happiness was mostly a question of knowing what you actually wanted versus what you had been taught to think you wanted, Margaret said. He said most people spend their whole lives chasing the second thing and wondering why it does not satisfy. He was a wise man, Charles said. He was a stubborn, impractical, completely wonderful man, Margaret said fondly, and I miss him every week. The year following Henry's birth was the year the ranch became real. Charles bought 6 horses with the money from the cattle work he had done over the winter, good breeding stock from a reputable source in New Mexico, and he built the first proper stable on the property, a solid structure of pine timber that Gertrude helped design with an eye toward the particular way the South Colorado wind moved, positioning the opening so that the horses would be sheltered from the worst of the winter blasts while still getting the morning light. He learned quickly that his instinct about horses versus cattle had been sound. He had a patience with horses that he had never fully had with cattle, a quality of attention and consistency that the animals responded to. And within a year, he had a reputation among the ranchers south of Denver as someone who could be trusted with difficult horses, which was valuable in that country. Gertrude ran the domestic and practical organization of the ranch with the same fierce, intelligent competence she brought to everything. And she added to it, in the year after Henry was born, a project that she had been planning quietly for several months. She wrote to the new school in the nearest small town, a settlement called Clearwater 12 miles north of their property, and offered to teach reading and arithmetic 2 days a week to the children, whose parents could not afford to send them to the school in town. The response from those families was overwhelming. Within a month, she had 14 children coming to a corner of the cabin that she had set up with simple materials. And within 3 months, the local church had offered her the use of their meeting room, so she did not have to have 14 children in her kitchen. Charles rode with her to Clearwater on teaching days, and he waited, working with whoever needed an extra pair of hands in town, and he rode back with her in the afternoons. He did not think of this as an obligation. He thought of it as one of the particular pleasures of his week, the two of them on the road together in the early light, the way they used to be on the trail north from Caldwell, talking about everything and nothing, and afterward the particular satisfaction of her telling him about the morning's lesson and what each child had managed, and what was still difficult, and the specific, individual ways that 14 different minds were approaching the same problems. She loved teaching with the same quality of wholehearted engagement she brought to everything she cared about, and it was clear that the children loved her back, not in the anxious, placating way of children who are afraid of disappointing an adult, but in the expansive, enthusiastic way of children who are genuinely enjoying themselves and know it. In the spring of 1882, Charles rode into Denver on business and stopped at the general store on Larimer Street to pick up supplies, and he overheard two men at the counter talking about the railroad's expansion south of Denver and what it would mean for the land values in the creek bottoms along the South Platte tributaries. He listened with the careful attention of a man with a stake in the answer, and afterward he went to see a man at the land office who had been recommended to him as knowing the future of the territory better than most, and he came home 2 days later with a set of maps and a head full of information that he laid out on the kitchen table after supper while Henry was asleep. Gertrude sat across from him in the lamplight and looked at the maps with her chin in her hand, and he explained what he had learned, and she asked questions that were exactly the right questions, cutting to the implications he had not yet fully thought through, and at the end of the conversation she said, "We should acquire the Whitmore parcel." He looked up at her. "The Whitmore parcel is the 200 acres on the eastern edge of our property line," she said. "Old Whitmore has been talking about selling for 2 years. If the railroad comes through where those maps suggest, that land will be worth 4 times what he is asking for it within 5 years, and it also connects our creek access to the main tributary, which would give us year-round reliable water for a much larger horse operation." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know what Whitmore is asking for it?" "Because his wife told me at the school fundraising supper in March," she said, with the patient expression of a woman who has understood for some time that an enormous amount of useful information moves through conversations that men are not present for. He laughed. Then he said, "Can we afford it?" "If you sell the 2 bay geldings before fall," she said, "and if I am right about the teaching income through summer, yes." They bought the Whitmore parcel in July. Old Whitmore was grateful for the transaction, which allowed him to retire to his daughter's house in Colorado Springs, and he shook Charles's hand and then, somewhat to Charles's surprise, turned and shook Gertrude's hand as well, with the air of a man who understood perfectly well who had made the decision. She was right about the railroad. By 1884, the tracks had come through a section exactly where the land office man had predicted, and the value of land along the creek bottom had increased exactly as she had calculated. And the Donovan Ranch, which was what people called it though the sign on the gate read simply Donovan, was a legitimate and increasingly prosperous operation with 20 horses, a reliable reputation for quality, and a waiting list from ranchers and cavalry buyers who wanted what Charles raised. Their second child was born in the winter of 1883, a girl they named Clara Margaret, Clara for Gertrude's mother and Margaret for the woman who had opened her house in Denver and asked nothing in return and given them the time they needed to find each other properly. Clara was a quieter, more watchful child than Henry, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and she had a particular tenderness with the horses from the time she could walk, which made Charles and Gertrude look at each other over her head with the particular smile of parents who are watching a child reveal themselves. Henry, at 3, greeted his sister with an exacting scrutiny, and then, apparently satisfied, appointed himself her chief authority on all matters, a role he pursued with an enthusiasm that would occupy his parents for the next decade. Margaret came every few months from Denver, and her visits were always the same, full of food and conversation, and the warm, slightly conspiratorial quality that she and Gertrude had together, talking in the kitchen while Charles and Henry did whatever project Charles had invented to occupy a 3-year-old boy without either of them getting hurt. On these visits, Margaret brought news of Denver, which was growing at a pace that seemed to surprise even the people who had predicted the growth. And she brought books, because she and Gertrude shared a serious appetite for reading, and had developed a system of trading titles through Margaret's network of Denver acquaintances. On one of these visits in the autumn of 1884, Margaret sat on the porch after supper watching the sun go down over the mountains and said to Charles, who had come out for a moment while Gertrude settled the children, "I have been thinking about Hector." "What about him?" Charles said. "I have been thinking about what he knew and what he hoped," she said. "About giving you a reason to go to Wichita and then a reason to bring her here and then just leaving the two of you to it and trusting that the right thing would happen." She paused. "He was a practical man, Hector. He was not given to hoping for things that were not reasonable to hope for, but he hoped for this." Charles looked at the mountains, which were going the particular color they went at this hour, the blue-gray deepening to violet at the peaks. "I know he did," he said. "He told me the last evening before he died. He did not put it directly, but he told me." "Are you angry with him?" Margaret asked, "for the arrangement of it?" "No," he said, and that was the most honest thing he had ever said. "I am grateful for it. I was a man who was moving past things because I had not found a thing worth stopping for. He pointed me toward the thing worth stopping for." He paused. "The rest was us." "The rest was absolutely you," Margaret agreed. "I just like to give him the credit for the opening move." Inside the house, they could hear Gertrude singing the low, repeated fragments she sang when she was settling the children, the same half-song she had sung to herself in the cabin while plastering walls and planting the kitchen garden, and the sound came through the warm lamplight of the window and into the cool evening air. Charles listened to it for a moment with the particular quality of attention he had never stopped bringing to that sound. "It was a very good opening move," he said. "The years that followed were the kind that do not make dramatic stories, but are the substance of a real life. There were hard winters and good summers, and the ordinary 1,000 negotiations of two people building something together out of different strengths and different habits, and the shared commitment to making it work. There were arguments, some of them real ones, in which they discovered the precise locations of each other's stubborn places and learned, with some effort and some grace, how to approach those places without breaking something important. There were evenings so good that Charles thought about them for years afterward, and mornings so difficult that he was not proud of how he managed them. And all of it, every piece of it, was part of the same thing, which was the real life of two real people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and kept choosing each other through everything that followed. Henry started school in Clearwater in 1885, riding the 12 miles with his father, and meeting his mother at the schoolroom door with a dignity that was both earnest and slightly hilarious in a 6-year-old. He was quick in his learning and competitive about it, in a way that Gertrude managed with the patient skill of a teacher, who had long since learned that competitive children need to be pointed at their own previous performance rather than at each other's. He was also a boy who climbed everything, broke things accidentally with impressive regularity, and had a gift for animals that manifested mostly as an ability to convince horses to do what he wanted through sheer confidence and a complete absence of doubt about the outcome. Clara, when she started school 3 years later, revealed herself to be a methodical, thorough student who read at a level 2 years ahead of her age and had opinions about everything, which she expressed with a precision that made Gertrude press her lips together in a way that was not entirely about hiding laughter. She wanted, from the age of approximately 7, to be a doctor, a desire she expressed so clearly and consistently that everyone around her began to take it seriously rather than treating it as the passing fancy it might have been in another child. In 1887, Charles expanded the stable significantly, taking on 2 hired men full-time to help with the increased scale of the horse operation, both of them local men with families, good workers who came with their own capabilities and required mostly direction and fair dealing, which Charles provided without difficulty. The ranch had become by that point a real business, with accounts and contracts and a reputation that extended beyond the immediate territory, and he handled the business side with the same methodical care he brought to the horses, doing the thing in front of him thoroughly before moving to the next thing. Gertrude continued to teach through all of this. When Clara was born, she had taken a season away and then gone back, and after that she simply arranged things as they needed to be arranged, which was a sentence that contained several years of practical problem-solving and the kind of flexible determination that makes things work that other people say cannot be managed. By 1887, she was the closest thing Clearwater had to a formal school teacher, respected in the community with a warmth and specificity that went beyond the ordinary respect given to teachers, because she had been there through enough difficult harvests and hard winters and family troubles to have proven that her interest in the community was not professional or transitory, but genuinely personal. On a cold evening in December of 1887, when Henry was 7 and Clara was 4, and the ranch was doing better than Charles had dared to plan for, they sat together after the children were in bed in the way they had sat on the porch in Hector's homestead, and on the trail by the fire, and in Margaret's kitchen on the night that had changed everything. And the feeling of it was the same, that complete, particular ease of 2 people who have the same interior vocabulary, who do not have to translate themselves for each other. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about my father every day," she said. Not with grief anymore, mostly, more just awareness. That he existed, that he was exactly who he was, that he did the thing he did, asking you to come for me, knowing he could not ask me to let him help me, knowing I would have fought the arrangement if he had put it to me straight. She paused. He knew me well enough to know that I needed to discover you myself, not to be sent to you like a parcel with an address on it. Charles thought about this. And do you think you would have discovered me if he had arranged it more directly? No, she said simply. I think I would have been so determined not to be arranged that I would have arranged myself out of the best thing that ever happened to me. She looked at him with the direct, clear gaze that had not changed from the first moment he had stood in the doorway of the boarding house in Wichita. He was smarter than I gave him credit for. He was the smartest man I knew, Charles said. He spent 50 years watching people and learning them, and it made him very good at seeing the thing under the thing. She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked seeing this, she said softly, gesturing at the room, the house, the life indicated by both. He would have liked seeing what it became. Charles looked around the room that had been a crumbling cabin 8 years before, at the fire in the hearth and the books on the shelf and the children's boots by the door, and the painting of a woman standing in a field on the wall opposite the window, the one that had traveled wrapped in his extra shirt from Hector's homestead to Denver to here, hung in the spot Gertrude had chosen on the day they had finally, properly moved in. He sees it, Charles said. He did not say it as theology or philosophy, just as the thing he believed, simply and without elaboration. Gertrude looked at the painting for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think he does." The spring of 1888 brought a letter from Margaret in Denver, written in her brisk, efficient hand, telling them that she had decided to sell the Denver house and move permanently to a small property in the mountains west of the city, a decision she had been considering for 3 years and had finally made because, as she put it, the city was becoming very large and very loud, and she had always preferred places where she could hear herself think. She was 60 years old and in good health, and she wanted to spend the next chapter of her life in the mountains, which she had loved since her first sight of them. She also wrote that the proceeds from the Denver house, which was now worth considerably more than she had paid for it, were more than she needed for the mountain property, and that she intended to settle a portion on Gertrude directly, not as charity, but as the inheritance from Hector's property sale in Caldwell, which Margaret had been holding in trust pending the right moment, augmented by her own feeling that a woman should always have resources that are entirely her own. Gertrude read this letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. She should not have done that, she said finally. She did it because she wanted to, Charles said. And because she is not in the habit of doing things she does not want to do. Gertrude looked at the letter for another moment. I want to use it to build the proper school in Clearwater, she said. Not just the church meeting room, a real schoolhouse. He looked at her. He was not surprised. He was not even close to surprised. How much will it cost? He said. Less than she is sending, she said, with the slight smile of someone who has already done the calculation. Then let's build a school, he said. The Clearwater schoolhouse was completed in the autumn of 1888, a proper building with 4 windows and a real wood floor, and a porch with a rail that Charles built himself over 2 weekends. And on the day it opened, every family in the area came, and the children filed in with the specific reverence of children entering a space that has been built for them and for the purpose of their becoming. Gertrude stood at the front of the room and looked at all those faces, and then turned and found Charles's face at the back of the room, where he was standing with Henry on one side of him and Clara on the other, and the look they exchanged was the kind that contains too much to be spoken and does not need to be. Henry Hector Donovan grew up to be a rancher like his father, with a specific gift for the horse breeding side of the business that eventually became its own enterprise, and he married a young woman from a neighboring ranch at 21 and built a house on the north edge of the Donovan property, and the sound of his children's voices added itself to the sounds of the ranch in a way that made everything feel abundantly, appropriately full. Clara Margaret Donovan did become a doctor. It took years of persistence and the specific stubbornness of a woman who has decided she is going to do a thing and will not hear argument to the contrary. And it required going east for her training, and coming back west because the west was where she was most fully herself. And she set up practice in Clearwater in 1906 in the building that had once been the schoolhouse, before the new, larger school was built. And she delivered babies and treated fevers and set broken bones, and was exactly who she had always intended to be. Charles and Gertrude grew into their middle age with the particular grace of people who have found the thing they were meant to be doing, and are doing it alongside the person they were meant to be doing it with. The lines in his face deepened and the gray came into his hair and hers, and none of it diminished anything, only added to it, the way a good landscape looks better in every different light and season. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in September of 1904, with Margaret, now in her mid-70s and still sharp and warm and entirely herself, making the journey down from the mountains for the occasion, and Henry and his wife and their 3 children, and Clara home from her final year of medical training, and a gathering of neighbors and friends from Clearwater and the surrounding country who had known them long enough to understand what was being celebrated. In the evening, after the guests had gone and the children and grandchildren had settled, Charles and Gertrude sat on the porch in the September dark the way they had sat on so many porches in so many good evenings of their life together, and the mountains were dark shapes against the stars and the air smelled of pine and grass and the particular clean freshness of the Colorado autumn. 25 years, she said. 25 years, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking something she was about to say. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had said no to my father in Caldwell? He thought about it honestly. Sometimes, he said, not with worry, just as a kind of arithmetic, what the sum would have been if you had subtracted this. What do you get when you do that arithmetic? she said. He looked at her in the dark, at the shape of her that he knew so completely that he could have drawn it from memory at any time of day or night, at the silver in her hair, and the quality of her attention that had not changed since the morning she had stood at the livery stable in Wichita in the gray pre-dawn light and been there before him. "Nothing that makes sense," he said. "Everything that makes sense is in the other calculation, the one where I said yes." She took his hand in the dark, the way she had taken it that first night in Margaret's kitchen, with the same quality of deliberateness, the same completeness. "He gave us such a gift," she said quietly. "He was dying, and the thing he did with what was left of him was give us the chance to find each other." She paused. "I hope he knows." Charles looked at the mountains, at the stars over them, at the enormous and benign darkness of the Colorado night that had been the backdrop of the best years of his life. "He knows," he said. And the night settled around them, warm and full of the sounds of the ranch and the distant mountains and the quiet breathing of children asleep inside, and they sat together in the good dark and were content, which is a word that sounds small and is in fact the largest thing there is, containing within it everything that had brought them here. The dying man's faith and the long trail and the fire by the creek and the dusty cabin and 25 years of mornings and evenings, and every real and honest thing that had been said between them, adding up to this. Two people on a porch in the Colorado night, holding hands home.